Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. So I floated on Facebook the idea associated with George W. Bush being the most divisive president and just generally like the most impactful president associated with mass carnage and general death. And the thing that interests me about this narrative is that the stuff associated with Trump is to be seen. Obviously, there are some actions that are taking place currently, but it really would take 2 or 3 years before we can get to a clear indication of what the Trump legacy will be like. And part of this narrative, as I've already alluded to, is associated with a sense of the past 24 years, maybe 28 years, and America's foreign policy and just general behavior over this period of time. I mean, part of it is a satire. I wouldn't necessarily say a satire, but a means of pointing out very strongly that be they Democrat or Republican, they seem to do the same thing with regards to far too many issues. So I guess the people who are coming out and saying that Trump is going to be a disaster and he's the most divisive president in, recent history or whatever, my perspective is that these people are following line and sinker a Democrat narrative which was trying to get them to come out and vote for Hillary Clinton, even though she was further right, more authoritarian, but let's just say really far right compared to any Democratic candidate since the 1950s. So a lot of the current Trump backlash actually comes through people who are in a hysteria associated with the side effects, more than anything, of the very curious propaganda which has been enacted by the DNC instead of contrasting policies, perhaps, in any case. So I got into this on Facebook in large part, not necessarily to agitate people, but at least to try and get people to think. And one of the narratives that came through this was associated with the US leading the environmental effort associated with climate change, in particular in industry. And here I need to give a shout out to my new podcast, This Comes Next, because This Comes Next is about, in large part, environmental policy and environmental industries. And I have the benefit of a co-host who has worked for 350.org, which I think is one of the few organizations that takes both simulation science and public policy and puts them together. One of the narratives that I have associated with the US's role in green industry, let's call it that, is associated with my early experiences working in a research physics institution in Canberra, Australia. I was 16, 17 at the time, so we're talking 22, 23, 24 years ago. It was the first serious job that I had where I earned really good money. And I worked typically 20 to 40 hours a week at this job. It was a job I loved. It was a job with elderly scientists. The main scientist that I was working with, Dr. Reg Mills, had a brain tumor that was moving very, very slowly. And it was just a real privilege to work with someone. In fact, a group of scientists. I mean, there was a guy called Larry Wolf as well. They were just really wise, really considered folk who were in their fields very, very brilliant and very well published and well known. And the nature of the environmental science, the nature of the environmental engineering that we were doing was associated with what I call thermal batteries. Now, batteries here means a means of storing energy. It's not associated with electricity. It's associated with temperature, thermal temperature, for want of a better term. And back when I used to work in that environment, I had all the words known. Picking up the language of this particular form of physics was something that I did. I don't know, it wasn't necessarily intuitively, but it was something that I devoted my time to. And it's actually a skill that is very useful even to this day, and I've used it most recently with model rail radio. When I worked with these physicists, they were creating effectively what would look today a bit like solar cells, but they were really solar panels that people installed in their roofs. And it might have had to, the insulation part of a roof and all this kind of stuff, they had to translate from the surface that the sun hit to the surface that actually conducted heat into the house. But the idea was that these thermal batteries would store heat energy through the day, and in the evening move this heat energy into the house. And for relatively small changes in temperature, just like a warm winter sun, basically, these heat batteries would store that energy sufficient that in the evening you would be able to heat a home with the energy that had been stored through the day, just through the sun, through a winter sun. And what the technology also potentially could do was create reverse cooling a house through summer, through reverse energy, through these thermal cells, through these batteries, for want of a better term. The technology was based on long-chain hydrocarbons and the interactions that mixtures of long-chain hydrocarbons had. So the idea would be that you'd have 3 or 4 layers of these long-chain hydrocarbons. Here, when I say layers, I guess they'd be, some kind of conductive, probably aluminium, as they said in Australia, or aluminum, as they say in the US. And you'd have these layers of long-chain hydrocarbons. They're goop, for want of a better term. I mean, they're like, very viscous fluids. And these things would store energy in a very curious way to enable, in one case, the heating example that I've provided, but in another case, the cooling example that I've provided. And my role at the research school was to run computerized experiments with large ethanol baths to create the thermal properties associated with, winter sun or summer sun, and mix the various chemicals, or at least test the mixed chemicals. And here the chemicals are long-chain hydrocarbons, in order to see what the thermal properties were like. What you're looking for here is almost like a thermal switch, that some of these hydrocarbons will solidify, but mainly that these hydrocarbons have a point where their transfer of energy changes. The transfer of energy in these hydrocarbons is nonlinear, which means you come to a point where there is a switch, where either more energy is needed to continue the transfer or less energy is needed to continue the transfer. And the idea in this thing was that you could change the way insulation and home heating worked. The point that I make through this is environmental research. This is second-generation environmental research going on in Australia in, the mid-90s? I mean, this is one generation of retiring scientists. Then there was another generation of retiring scientists that occurred after I left Australia. And we're now in the third, fourth generation of these scientists in Australia. Now, truth be told, Australia has moved to the far right in ways which make the US look like a distinctly leftist environment. And a number of the environmental scientists, a number of the next generation that these scientists impact, that carry on their work, the research folk that follow on from these initial scientists. Many of them left Australia. Most of them went to Europe. Some of them did come to the US. So the US, in short spurts and starts, has had, in the past 10 years, the early fledgling stages environmental scientists working on green engineering projects, but very few and far between. The role that the war budgets and the money that has gone into killing R&D has had in the US cannot be underscored. So when people say to me that the US is leading a charge associated with environmental engineering and environmental science, doesn't fit in with my narrative. If you have a good counterexample, you should probably give it. And in this case, this is the counterexample that I gave. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.